What's up, everyone? Still talking about presentation of data, but now talking about histograms. So let's get into it. So we've already talked about discrete group data, and now we're going to talk about continuous grouped data. So in general, each group is called a class, and the size of those classes or the size of that group are called class intervals. As a rule of thumb, you want approximately the square root of n classes for a data with n values. So if you have 49 pieces of data, in general, you might want about 7 classes. And that's just a rule of thumb. You can definitely play it by ear and play it by problem. It's going to depend on the problem, but just kind of to give you an idea of roughly around how many classes you should have. When we talked about discrete data, we talked about bar charts, and now that we're talking about continuous data, we're going to talk about histograms. So the histogram in general is the continuous version of the column graph or of a bar chart. And like I said, it's used for continuous data. The biggest difference between a bar chart and a histogram, besides that you're looking at two different pieces of data, are that there are no spaces between the columns, because continuous data is talking about ranges of pieces of information or measurements of information. Its display also will be continuous with no space between the columns. So let's get into an example. In example 2 here, we have a lot of data listed below that gives the lengths of steel rods measured in meters as produced by a machine. So since there's a lot of data and it's continuous, we should organize this data into intervals. These class intervals that we create should be of equal length and should be constructed so that each value is only assigned to one class interval. The size of those intervals are obviously going to depend on the data. Like, for example, this data are all fairly small, between 0 and 6, let's say. But in terms of how many of those, we already talked about that you want roughly the square root of the number of pieces of data you have. But also just keep in mind that 6 to 12 intervals in general is usually pretty good. So with our data here, we have a total of 50 pieces of data. So based on the square root rule of thumb, that means I want roughly around 7 intervals. But really, again, it depends on just what's good for the data. So for example, for this data, if I go from my lowest is 0.65 and my highest is 5.75, that means I'm basically, again, going from 0 to 6. Splitting that up into 7 different intervals is going to be a little bit weird. So I'm just going to take it and I'm going to split it up into 6 different intervals where I go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, etc. So I'm basically just counting by ones. Note that, remember we had said each of these data pieces can only, or each of these pieces of data can only go into one single interval. So if you notice, I'm not including any of the upper end of the intervals, only the lower end of the intervals. So that way, if I had a steel rod that measured 1 exactly, it could only go into this interval, not into this one as well. So we're going to play this similar to how we did it with the discrete data. Then I'm going to go through all 50 pieces of my data and count how many do I have between 0 and 1, how many do I have between 1 and 2, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so I went through all my data. I wrote in all my frequencies. Again, just to give you an example, I only had 1 that was between 0 and 1. Between 1 and 2, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I just went through that same kind of deal for all of them. So again, in order to just double check that you have the correct amount of pieces of data, this frequency or these frequencies should add up to 50. Since I had 50 pieces of data, my frequency should also be 50. Example 2 continued. Once our data has been summarized into a frequency table, which I transferred over from the previous slide, but I also changed my intervals just because it's faster to me to write it in interval notation than using the inequalities. Then we can start to represent it in a histogram. So if you notice this graph, we have already scaled your X and Y axes for you. The scaling on the X-axis does look different because remember, this is one continuous scale. So from 0 to 1, from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, to 5 to 6. So there is no breaks between this. That's why it has to look a little bit different. You don't have to write that scaling because it's implied in how you scale the actual axis. We do, however, need to give this a title. So I could say steel rod length. Oops. Or lengths. I need to label my X and Y axes. So I could say that my X axis is the actual rod length. Usually good to say what it was measured in this case in meters. And then my X or my Y axis was the actual number of rods. All right, so actually creating the histogram once you have it all scaled and labeled, very similar to the bar charts. Again, there's just no spacing between your columns at all. So between 0 and 1, I had a frequency of 1. Note the scaling on my x-axis this time, or my y-axis and my x-axis actually. So I got one tiny little block between 0 and 1. Between 1 and 2, I had 5 steel rods. So these are butting up right next to each other, connected. And again, just shading them in real quick just so that we know that there is something there. Sometimes, especially when it's pencil and paper, it's hard to tell. So I'm just going to continue to do that for the other 4 intervals that I have. All right, so finishing out my histogram, I had 8 rods between 2 and 3, 3 rods between 3 and 4, 14 rods between 4 and 5, and 19 rods between 5 and 6. So I think moral of the story, wrapping up our first set of presentation of data, bar charts are used for discrete data, histograms are used for continuous data. And again, most of this is for the IA for when you actually go to present your data in your internal assessment. That's not to say that there aren't IB questions that have you maybe finish a histogram or use a histogram or a bar chart to complete a frequency table and then do something else. They just usually won't have you fully create an entire bar chart or histogram in an IB question.